So a friend of mine who lives in Granada recently had his house rebuilt, and the builders found on the ground floor a couple of skeletons that were facing the Qibla.
Wow.
And they were thought to be 18th century. So that family had kept up the traditions in secret, risking being burnt at the stake for many generations. So that's the kind of resilience of Islam. It doesn't die away quickly. Because it's the religion of fitra. People love the idea of monotheism. They love the idea of a timeless, beautiful, simple, quite short form of worship. What's not to like? Of course, on the surface, you have the Taliban and ISIS and crisis after crisis, which is what the media tend to report. But it's a kind of mirror image of the West. In the West, on the surface, everything is nice. But underneath, you have a demographic crisis. You have the environmental crisis. You have the crisis of loneliness. We now have the world's first Minister of Loneliness in the UK.
Really? I didn't know.
Yeah, because society is fraying so fast. So that's the society into which Muslims are being invited to integrate. So there's certain things that are still rough and ready, but still more or less functional. The Muslim family, the Muslim neighborhood, the place of worship, the idea of gender, these things are still maintained despite everything. But the surface, of course, which the media reports, is uproar, constant uproar. But beneath the surface, there's stillness.
But what about, I mean, this, I don't mean to go on, this is a separate subject, I don't want to go into it all now, but what about the second generation, the third generation of Muslim immigrants, the offspring of the, are they retaining the faith, or are they hemorrhaging all over the place and will disappear like, water in the sand, or will they retain their... Well,
in the book, I do talk a little bit about retention, and there's been some sociological work done on it. So 26% of Christian parents statistically can expect their children to be churchgoers if they are churchgoers. 26%. Right. In the case of Muslims, it's 71%, which is not 100%, but still a rate of survival. Plus the converts, plus big families means that the mosques are likely to be well used for some time to come.
Well, that's true.
So retention rates. But of course, there's part of the problem is that the culture of many mosques in England reflects the cultural needs and focus of first generation migrant communities who came not so much with Islam, but with their culture.
Yeah.
And that's fine for the first generation. But the second generation, which has been to British schools and has a kind of British soul, effectively, may not feel particularly at home in those spaces, and the khutbahs may not be very relevant, and that's the danger, really. That in Islam we have this idea of orf, local custom, which is a valid and respected thing as long as it doesn't violate something in the Quran and the Sunnah. But if you have the orf of somewhere else, and you're expecting young people with their own local orf to relate harmoniously to that, then you have a cognitive dissonance that can result in disaffiliation. And I think that's the main problem, that people find the mosques exotic, kind of spaces where an overseas beauty is maintained rather than something that speaks to the kind of questions that they're having to ask here in Britain.
On that point about earth, I probably mispronounced it, culture. Am I right in thinking that concept is an important element to Sharia itself, that it recognizes the legitimacy and value of a culture? And it might not be an Arabic culture or a Bangladeshi, it could be a British, an English culture, is actually explicitly, as long as it can, it doesn't violate Sharia, as long as we're not talking about alcohol abuse or pornography or loneliness. We're talking about those positive aspects of culture are recognized by the Sharia. Is that right?
Yeah, and this is part of the universalism, and part of the beautiful wisdom of Islam is, just as even though it makes strong prophetic points against the Ahl al-Kitab, because that's what prophecy does, it still is very generous. It still says, Laysu sawa, they're not all the same. Amongst them is a community that is upright. It tells us to be respectful to them. That's part of the unique brilliance of the Quran amongst other prophetic documents, in that it's respectful, even though it comes as a kind of repair. Similarly, where Islam has traveled historically, if you look at what it's done to the literatures of the peoples that it has touched, it doesn't replace them with a kind of uniform Arabness, but actually triggers or galvanizes a new flourishing in those literatures. If you look at Persian literature,
yes,
before Islam, well, it's a few Avestan prayers and incantations to various kings. It's not much. Then Islam comes, and you have Hafiz and Rumi and Sa'di, and it's but in Farsi. So it tends to fecundate the local. And it's the same with Turkish literature, which before Islam was really nothing at all. Many of the literatures of the subcontinent, of West Africa, and so forth. So it's a principle that, while uncompromising about Tawheed and about the inviolability of the basic sacred forms, you don't introduce local customs into your Fajr prayer, for instance, and nobody would have the temerity to do that. That's universal. That at the same time, in terms of the more informal aspects of people's lives, how they dress, what they eat, the language they use, and also in their literature and perhaps some of their extra canonical rituals in, say, the context of Sufism, you'll find that local sacralities and local languages tend to be uplifted. And this is why Orf is, none of this is controversial. It's there in all of the classical texts of Shariah. A maxim of the Shariah is al-ma'rufu orfan kal-mashru'i shar'an, which is to say, that which is known through local custom is like that which is legislated by revelation.
Wow.
Which some people nowadays, with a kind of rather limited view that they have of Islam, find startling. But that's particularly effective in terms of qada, what the qadi does in a law court. He'll look at the books of Sharia, but he'll also look at what the local custom is. And if that custom is not violating something that's known in revelation, in which case it has to shut up and die. If it's not violating that, then that becomes Islam for those people. And so the challenge for us in the West is to see whether we are going to use the orf of Indonesia, in Holland, or Kurdistan, in Sweden, and that's how we have to be as Muslims, or whether the traditional inculturation that the Ummah has always been pretty good at is going to be possible for us in modern Europe. So what should a mosque in Sweden look like, for instance? Well, should it look like a Turkish mosque or a Moroccan mosque or a Kurdish mosque? Most of them do that. And that can be quite divisive because it cements ethnic divisions in the community, which are weakening. But what would a Swedish mosque look like? And how would a Swedish imam dress? And what kind of poetry, Islamic poetry, would you want to write using the particular genius and strengths of the Swedish language? And that's something that is starting now. I must say it is starting.
It has to be convert-led, presumably. It can't be.
Well, not necessarily. If you look at some of the sort of rather Dutch-looking mosques in Holland now, in Rotterdam, for instance, a very interesting big mosque in Rotterdam, which draws a lot on Dutch styles of architecture. That's not primarily convert-led. That's led by. So I think that the differentiation that one saw between the converts and the cradle Muslims, if you like, in the 80s and 90s is starting to die away.
Right.
I think it may be that the age of the convert is coming to an end, really, and that we're going to see this new generation really powering ahead, which will be, I think, a good thing. And it is often, like in a mosque in Cambridge, which tries to be British as well as sort of Islamic in various ways, using local British patterns of brickwork and Gothic vaulting and so forth. That's been very strongly supported by the local community, which is Bangladeshi, Turkish, and so forth. Once it's explained to them that this is a way of being courteous to your neighbors, you don't really want a mosque that they experience as an insult. It has to be courteous, as long as it's not violating something in the scripture. What's wrong with courtesy?
And courtesy is an Islamic virtue. It's something that God himself talked about endlessly. This is not some kind of English gentleman virtue. This is an Islamic virtue as well.
Yeah, it's neighborliness. Yeah. So somebody once came to the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, offering him some stew, and his reply was, هل أهديت منها لجارك اليهودي? Have you offered some to your Jewish neighbor? So this idea of neighborliness, which is very big in Islam, doesn't just mean Muslim neighbors, but also non-Muslim neighbors. And this is something that you can see again and again in the Seerah. Yeah, the public statements of Islam's presence have to be, if we're sensible, respectful rather than irritants.
Yeah.
I was recently looking at the speech of the mayor of Pécs, I think it is, in southern Hungary, who is from Orbán's party, anti-immigrant, building fences and so forth. Yeah. And there's a historic mosque in Pécs, which was built by the Ottomans. Sure. And the interviewer was saying, well, you've got a Muslim community here, why don't you allow the mosque to open up again? And he said, no, because they have different traditions. They dress differently and they eat food that's very different from ours. And he named all of the things that have nothing to do with Islam as a religion, but to do with the urf of recently arrived people as he understands it. So very often Islamophobia fixes on superficial things that are religiously dispensable anyway. So I'm, in the longer term, quite optimistic because you see with the new generation, certainly the third generation, they're really very French and Swedish. I was talking to a guy in Cologne recently. There's a huge new mosque there. And as you go into the mosque, the sign says Turkish mosque, Turkish mosque. On every door, a big sign, Turkish mosque. The Turks are maybe 50% of the Muslims of Cologne, but they wanted to make this statement. And there's a bookshop, but it has books in Turkish, all books in German, all translated from Turkish, you know, the kind of scene. And this young guy, even though he's a second generation, his parents are Turkish, says, I'm German, I'm not Turkish. Yeah. So I don't really feel that that's my place. And there's going to be more and more people like that. And as the mosques make the transition, which is pretty easy to do in many ways, because you don't have to change the ibadah or any of the essential functions, from being a place of refuge for first generation, understandably kind of defensive communities, to something that's more open and dawah oriented, then you'll see not just the younger generation feeling more at home in the mosque, but also more and more non-Muslims coming to the mosque, recognizing Islam for what it is, and inshallah joining us. So in the longer term, I'm pretty optimistic.